Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, from time to time, I like to explore new channels, ones that I haven't watched anything from before, and maybe expose those channels to our 400,000 plus subscribers here on Vlogging Through History. Maybe introduce folks to a channel that they haven't seen or had recommended to them before. So this one's called Trust Me, Bro, and it's Weirdest Weapons from World War II. It looks like they might be mildly inspired by the likes of Salmonella, but the animation style is definitely different. There's some similarities, at least from the thumbnails that I could see. I haven't watched the video yet, but I thought this would be a good one to check out. I'll put the link down in the description to the original content so you can check it out and explore their channel as well. They've got about 77,000 subscribers at the moment. Speaking of channels, if you're new to this channel, you might not realize I do have some other channels as well. And all of those channels have new content in the last few days. Just this morning, my latest video on VTH Extra went live, which is my visit to Wrexham. I went to see Wrexham AFC play against Bradford City, so that's just kind of my little vlog of going to the football match there and exploring the town a little bit. So that's up. Just in the last couple of days, new content went up on Stories from the Great War, where I told the story of Polygon Wood, which I'm very proud of how that video came out, so you can check that out. And also, there's some new content up on the gaming channel. Links are in the description of every video to those other channels, so you can check that out. I want to give a shout out and a thank you to Damian Wade from Norfolk, Virginia, who is one of our latest executive producer level patrons. Incredible amount of support, and I cannot say enough to show you how grateful I am for that support. Let's go ahead and dive into the weirdest weapons from World War II.
If you're anything like me, you grew up playing Call of Duty, and one Call of Duty that always stood out specifically was Call of Duty World at War.
I wouldn't say I grew up playing it. I was already grown up by the time Call of Duty was a thing, but I definitely played a lot of Call of Duty.
This game was undoubtedly the catalyst for my fascination with the Second World War, and recently while doing one of my late night History Channel binges, I came across some really interesting weapons. So in this video, I put together a list of some of the weirdest and most obscure weapons from World War II. Oh, and these are going to start weird, but get even weirder. First up, we have the Krummlauf, which is a German invention. The Krummlauf itself is not a weapon, but it is a weapon modifier. The Krummlauf is a barrel extension for rifles, similar to a suppressor, although this one was curved with a 30-degree angle. Although it seems like something out of Looney Tunes, the purpose was quite ingenious. The Krummlauf was used for close quarters combats in urban situations, specifically shooting around corners and over trenches.
Now, you can obviously think of all the things that would be wrong with something like this. It did work for short range, but it didn't work for very long. And my understanding is these weapons, they didn't have a long lifespan.
The Krummlauf wasn't typically blind fired, as it also had a periscope attached to it to also see around the corners. As useful as this item may appear, it wasn't extremely practical because it had a few major downsides, mainly accuracy and durability. The periscope typically fastened with the Krummlauf was very susceptible to fogging up, which left huge room for inaccuracy, and the Krummlauf itself was very susceptible to the immense forces behind a bullet, not only controlling the bullet but also redirecting that bullet, and they typically were only good for a maximum of 300 shots. Personally, I think the look of the Krummlauf is one of the weirdest things about it. I think the idea isn't bad, it's just wasn't able to be executed properly. The Krummlauf is weird, but there's definitely weirder.
So I would think that you would understand the limitations of a weapon like that just because of the nature of how firearms work, but I also understand why they would try something like this. We have to remember that probably unlike any other times in history, war is a time for innovation, and necessity is the mother of invention. When you have a problem, you try and come up with a solution to that problem. Some of the most expensive things during the Second World War were projects like the B-29, which billions of dollars were poured into. Specifically to overcome the problem of how do we bomb mainland Japan when we don't have any air bases that are anywhere close. And so they had to develop a bomber that was big enough and could withstand, long flights, that could carry a lot of bombs to make it worth it, that had the range that was necessary. All of these things were developed because of the problem that they had. If you have a problem of trying to overcome your adversary in close quarters combat, you're going to come up with ideas like this. And for every bad idea that maybe had all kinds of issues, there were probably some really good ideas that when people first proposed them, there were people who were like, no way, there's no way that's going to work. And then it worked, and it became a war-changing item.
Which is why it's only the first entry on this list. Next up, we have the V3 Supergun, and super it is. The V3 Supergun was developed as a so-called vengeance weapon in order to strike back at London as...
And that's what that V stands for, just like the V1, the V2 rockets, vengeance.
Allied bomber fleets pounded German cities to rubble. The V3 cannon was capable of delivering a 140 kilogram shell at a range of over 161 kilometers. But big deal, right? Wow, a cannon that could shoot a little bit further. What's so special? Well, one of the most unique attributes about the V3 Supergun is how it achieved this enormous range, and its unique engineering. The secret to this enormous range and what made this gun truly special was the number of side channels attached to the 140 meter long barrel. These channels were filled with additional propellant which would be triggered by the shell as it traveled through the long barrel. Essentially what would happen is the shell would trigger the propellant as it would fly down the barrel, which would cause the propellant to explode, giving even more velocity. The long barrel with these channels would essentially allow the shell to be fired multiple times without even leaving the barrel.
Now, I don't know where he's going to go with this, and I don't know if this is going to be the case, but I can foresee an immediate problem with this, which is that if your timing is off, if that's got an explosive warhead on it, which I would assume it does, you could set that off and blow it up in the gun and maybe kill your crew.
The best analogy I can think of is when you're playing Mario Kart and you drive on a speed boost.
Yep.
That's basically what's happening inside the barrel. To me, the engineering behind this concept is really interesting, but the weirdest part is definitely the fact that the barrel was literally almost 500 feet long. Despite all the research, development, and resources that were put into this weapon, it wasn't really able to be executed properly. During some demo tests, it wasn't able to meet its hypothetical potential, and before they were able to truly implement it, they were destroyed by the Allied forces bombing and destroying the gun. Later, smaller variants were used on bombing raids against Luxembourg, but that's not what we're talking about here.
So there were precursors to this idea. These huge rail guns that were brought up during World War I and would be used to shell Paris from behind the German lines, even 20, 30, 40 miles away. So there's definitely a precedent for this. Of course, all of this requires you to have people on the ground in places like London, which the Germans certainly did, which allow you to then communicate back how effective your weapons have been. The V1 and V2 rockets, same kind of thing. So again, not surprised that Germany was looking for these things to get an edge when you are facing an enemy that's got more manpower, more industrial power, more of everything than you do. You have to try and get an edge any way you can, and technology is one of those places that they try to do that.
What we are talking about, however, is something the Russians did that I don't like at all. And you're
The
not going
dogs?
to like it. That being anti-tank dogs.
Yep.
Yeah, this one is exactly how it sounds, unfortunately. The Russians were strapping bombs to dogs.
What is it with Russians and dogs? They also sent Laika, the dog, up to die in space.
For them to detonate under tanks. How they do this? Well, in training, they would starve these dogs and then hide food under stationary tanks so the dogs would know to look under tanks for food. They would then bring these same dogs to the battlefield with bombs strapped on their backs. The idea was that the dog would run under an enemy tank and then the bomb on its back would explode. Besides this being extremely primitive and brutal,
The problem is you got to train them with German tanks or else they're going to go for Russian tanks. A little foreshadowing there.
This technique was also extremely ineffective. On the battlefield, these dogs were extremely scared of these tanks charging towards them, and combined with enemy fire, they wanted nothing to do with these enemy tanks. Also, some of these dogs would go back towards Russian tanks, hiding below them, causing friendly fire.
Yep.
Overall, this method is completely horrible and honestly not great. This technique is pretty on point.
It's horrible, but if you feel that exploding dogs under tanks is going to save the lives of people, then you become less concerned about the dogs. And let's face it, a lot of Soviet high command didn't exactly have the highest level of concern for human life in the first place.
For Russian military exercises, as their whole mentality is essentially throw bodies at something until the problem's solved. But anyway, staying on trend with explosive animals, we have our next entry, which is explosive rats. This one is interesting because it was a failure that actually turned into a pretty massive success. The British military weapons design team was looking for interesting ways to infiltrate the German infrastructure. Obviously, they were getting desperate because where they landed was explosive rats. This differs from the explosive dogs because these rats were no longer alive. The rats were found, killed, skinned, and essentially taxidermied but filled with a plastic explosive. These rats would be planted in and around coal storages on German bases.
Now, this seems really weird, but think about all of the technology that would come about in the decades after World War II during the Cold War, the spy tech that was out there, and some of the stuff we have today with things like drones and even making little bees into drones, like fake bees that you could fly, stuff like that. Stuff that if it failed, we would look back and say that's ridiculous, but this is no different than that, really.
With the intention of having them be thrown in the incinerator in boilers, triggering the explosive and causing a massive explosion.
Actually makes
now,
sense.
Here's where things get interesting. The Germans early on caught on to these explosive rats, and the British, because of this, stopped producing them. But Germany didn't know that, and because of that, the Germans were extremely paranoid about more explosive rats and spent a lot of resources and man hours strictly checking rats, dead and alive, on all of their military bases. Despite the fact that the rats were more effective than the dogs and I would say arguably less upsetting, I wouldn't say that this method is much better. For our third and final animal-based entry on the list, we have pigeon-guided missiles.
Nice.
Yep, you heard me right. Pigeon-guided missiles. But unfortunately, it's not as cool as it sounds. The birds that your grandma likes to throw bread at isn't also a double agent. Their primitive brains were just used for tracking, which is still pretty interesting. B.F. Skinner was a psychologist and a passionate pigeon trainer who believed that pigeons could be useful weapons of war. He was ultimately...
Pigeons were hugely useful in the First World War. Carrier pigeons used to communicate, very, very common. Obviously, that was not as needed in World War II with the advent of radio technology that could be carried by platoons and things like that, but vital in World War I.
Able to prove his theory right, as he was able to teach pigeons how to recognize targets and aim weapons accordingly. The pigeons had specially designed cockpits inside of these missiles which allowed them to peck their way to pick the direction they wanted the missile to go, pecking up, down, left, or right to control the missile accordingly. It's strange and insane to think that pigeons can be trained to literally guide missiles, but it's also kind of unfortunate that these birds were unintentional kamikazes. What was intentional...
Unintentional kamikazes. But holy cow, did that actually work?
Was our next entry. The Japanese Fugu balloon bomb. These bombs were extremely primitive in nature, being constructed solely out of paper. These paper bombs were huge, 33 feet in diameter for the most part, and could lift up to 1,000 pounds, but all they were lifting were 33-pound anti-personnel fragmentation bombs. The Japanese released these bombs into the Pacific jet stream, which would silently carry these large devices from Japan to the US without any pilot, and the trip would take several days. Despite releasing thousands of these devices, the balloon bomb was extremely ineffective, not to mention resource intensive. It took up to 30 minutes to an hour to prepare one balloon and required 30 hands on deck to create one. During the war, there was only 6 casualties reported from the balloon.
That's still incredible that there were any at all. When you're releasing a balloon with a bomb attached to it from thousands of miles away, the fact that anybody got hit by this stuff is remarkable.
His wife and 5 Sunday school children were on a fishing trip, encountered the balloon near Oregon, and sadly they fell victim to it. Although for this weapon to be considered successful, it would mean the death of people, which is obviously unfortunate. It is kind of laughable how ineffective this weapon was, considering all the time and energy that went into it. Finally, we have the last entry of this list, the Pajantrum. The Pajantrum never saw combat, but for reasons we'll get into, it was a fan favorite amongst civilians.
Oh, there's that famous thing.
The best way to describe the Bajandrum is a British-made rocket-powered wagon wheel battering ram, if that makes sense. To find a way to breach Germans' concrete defenses in Normandy, the British military devised a large carriage-like contraption called the Bajandrum. The device was propelled by rockets attached along the rim on the outside of the wheel, and in the middle there was a drum full of explosives. The goal was to have the Bajandrum speed towards the wall and break through it and eventually explode. The concept sounds simple enough and honestly kind of makes sense if you don't really think about it, but the biggest problem facing the Bajandrum was the fact that there are so many technical inconsistencies and issues.
Yeah, I mean, but the invasion of Normandy is a perfect example of where multiple innovations in technology had to be made. I mean, designing tanks that could float inland. Now, there were some serious problems with it because of the weather that day, but the tanks that could float, ships that could unload people in large numbers on the beaches, things to overcome things like, barbed wire with things like Bangalore torpedoes, and just all sorts of innovations like that. There were dozens and dozens. The Mulberry Harbors are another example. So many things that had to be basically invented from scratch just to allow that invasion to be successful. So I'm not surprised there were things that they tried and failed.
It's blowing off, the wheel going in the wrong direction, not generating enough force to penetrate the concrete wall. Although the general public enjoyed watching the live demonstrations of the Bajandrum, it was never brought to battle due to all of the technical inconsistencies of it. Besides the fact that all of these weapons were complete and utter failures, they all have one thing in common. They are weird. And they...
So that was good. I like his style. I said at the beginning that I thought from the thumbnail it looked like it was Salmonella style, but it's less so than I realized. It's definitely his own unique style of animation for sure. So as I mentioned at the beginning, if you want to check out the other channels, subscribe to those, turn on the notifications. I don't upload as frequently to them, but definitely trying to grow all of those channels while continuing to do regular content here on Vlogging Through History. So I hope you'll check those things out. I want to give a thank you and a shout out to Steven in Wheatland, PA, just down the road from me, maybe 25 minutes away, in Austin, down in Blue Springs, Missouri. Thank you both for your support on Patreon. Couldn't do it without you. Thanks for watching.